Welcome, everyone. We are excited for you all to be here. I'm Julie Thorner. I'm going to help moderate this amazing group today with our speaker and our panelists. You have arrived at the Thriving Together, a conversation on equitable and inclusive practices panel. We have a great setup this afternoon with a speaker and then a panel, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So thriving as an industry and a community is not a new challenge, certainly not for us and given this past year. Whether facing economic downturns or regulatory changes or the basic logistics of running a business at different scales, challenges are faced thinking about thriving forward. Work on equitable and inclusive practices for a changing and growing demographic requires comparable preparation, adaptation, and innovation in ways that can be good for business while being authentic and meaningful in addressing historic injustices. So I am excited to be a part of this, and let me share with you a little bit about the DEI Task Force. This task force came together this summer, and there are nine folks from AO on this task force. And it came together as a result of what was going on this summer. Certainly the pandemic has elevated our awareness, and we are wide awake to the things happening, not just with the pandemic, but the incredible racial injustice and the really difficult and tough things that happened this summer. And you'll know that list. And we thought, well, America Outdoors can do something to participate in this conversation and become as inclusive as possible. So we have an internal guidance statement that our group has come up with, and I will read that to you so you have a sense of what this task force is about. The America Outdoors Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force, that's short for DEI. Our objective is to support outfitters, members, and organizational leadership to learn and grow their DEI practices and efforts. The task force works to facilitate opportunities for DEI education and resources to our America Outdoors membership community. And we're going to have a short poll come up now. And while you're answering that poll, I am thrilled to introduce to you Jose Gonzalez. He's going to kick off this, this panel for us. Jose is the founder of Latino Outdoors. He's also a partner in the Avarna Group. And through his own consulting and his work focuses on equity and inclusion frameworks and practices in the environmental, outdoor, and conservation fields. He is an incredibly perfect person to help us kick off this first ever task force and panel for DEI issues, and will help us as we look to walk towards a more inclusive environment. Jose, we're thrilled to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie. I appreciate being here with all of you. And I want to check in just to make sure. I think people were filling out the poll, and if that is set, I wasn't sure if we'll see the first round of questions or answers at the moment. Otherwise, we can wait before we start.
Yeah, it might take a minute to come through.
No problem. Well, as that is going to pop up in a minute, first of all, I'm excited to be here. I'll explain a little bit about the outline of how we'll spend this hour together. First, I'm excited to kind of welcome three panelists, so three peers and colleagues of yours in the industry, Valerie, Justin, and Greg. I'll introduce them a little bit more after I do my formal presentation to kick us off. What we'll be doing is I'll spend about 10 minutes to kind of present a bit of frameworks in terms of starting points of engagement and what can be considerations in terms of how you approach this work, as well as setting it up for us to kick it directly into the conversation in which you get to hear directly from your peers about how they have been approaching this work. So it's appropriate in terms of the role modeling, as well as the type of ways of thinking and questions that can come up. And we'll close up with the last 10 to 15 minutes with an audience Q&A. So as you are listening to me and to others, please don't hesitate to drop a question in the chat, or it might even be a comment and observation, which Julie will also be checking out and monitoring and ensuring that if there's any questions, they'll get to be highlighted to us, and then we'll share along that way. So thank you for that. Okay, poll, or shall I kick off?
Yeah, I don't see the poll yet. Beth, maybe you can let us know our behind the scenes, behind the online curtain help there from the virtual event place. I don't see the poll result yet. Maybe it's not quite closed.
That's okay. We will. There will be another pause time. So if the poll is still being completed, don't stress, Beth. In about 10-ish minutes, we'll have another check-in for that. So first, so I'll start off by kicking off this part to lay a bit of groundwork. So let me make sure that you can see this. Perfect. So the key thing here in which I wanted to start off with is grounding a bit of the considerations and reality of this work, in addition to just, quote unquote, being the right thing to do. And I say that because I want to make sure that that's never misunderstood, that it is a right thing to do, and that in doing, in approaching this work, it has these other outcomes and benefits. That is the business case, that is the community engagement case, and so forth. Yet it's still grounded in this component of at least two considerations. One is the demographic inevitability. In other words, how we are continuing to change and grow as a country and as a nation. It's based on the reality that the demographics of 2050 or 2060 are going to be very different than 2050 and the 1950 and 1960. So that has real implications. And the more that we can be prepared for that and to lean into that and engage with that actually is a zone of opportunity rather than automatically one of concern or framing it as a zero-sum loss. So that's important. And this is, whether whatever data set that you're looking at, what we're able to notice is that generally speaking, a white demographic is going to continue to decrease as well as a Latino, Hispanic demographic, Black demographic, and an Asian demographic, as some examples, are going to continue to increase. And so this is the type of quote unquote majority, minority, that you're going to hear different terms around what that's going to look like. And so the second consideration is, what does this mean, not just in terms of, okay, we have more people that are different based on ethnicity and racial categories, as an example. And we're not going to dig too deep right now into race as a social construct. I want to stress that it's a yes and. Part of the idea that race is a social construct, if you only use that to say, hey, we're all humans, we all are the same in these different ways, you have to be careful, because it can promote an idea of colorblindness that doesn't acknowledge the fact that there are still actual tangible physical outcomes that are not the same for communities of color. And that's a real consideration. If you are a black man, as an example, you are just statistically more likely to have a different type of outcome interaction with law enforcement, regardless of the intention of either side, and very much separate from any ideas of criminality. And that in itself can be a hard idea to wrestle with. Yet at the end of the day, they're still part of the reason why we find ourselves in this moment, because we're engaging with this in a very different way. So I want to put that in there, because what this means is that this has an effect on the actual spaces of decision making. It's a question of power in that way. And I want to frame this in a way that isn't meant to be scary or terrifying or to think about it again as a zero-sum loss, but rather to be able to say, how can we continue to ensure that the things that we care about we'll continue to have that, knowing that the demographics are going to be different. So if we care about conservation success, about the stewardship of the public lands on which this industry relies on, about ensuring that how we connect and care with these natural landscapes will continue. How can that happen knowing that not just the people that visit them, as well as the customers that interact with them, in addition to the people that are the decision makers, the policy makers that support this, is going to be different. And that to me is the exciting component. So I share this because when we talk about DEI, it's important not just to think, oh, here's an additional thing that I have to do, or what does this have to do with like the work that I do, or how is this relevant, or at worst, thinking that it's a purely political, partisan type of approach. For me, it's just about acknowledging, like, hey, in this country, we have made these commitments, these aspirational commitments that we said we really want everybody to be able to thrive together, to be able to support each other in this type of, in this way in community. In the 1960s, we said that can start by ensuring that we take down the signs that said that if you're white, you get to use these facilities or these resources, and if you're not, you either don't get them or you have to use these. Literally, you can use this door for this, or you can use that door for that. And that reality is pretty recent. You have people alive that was their experience. So this isn't a thing that's far away. And for us to be able to, if we live up to the idea to say that we're better than this, then what does it mean to ensure that we go from that? And as the demographics shifts, that's going to impact the powers of decision making. Because in 1960s, it didn't mean that all elected officials all of a sudden changed and now you had more Black representation. That took time. It didn't mean that the heads of philanthropic organizations also shifted automatically. It didn't mean that the people in charge of corporate institutions or companies changed. So as this is happening, what does it mean to engage with that for mutual benefit? So that's what I really want to stress around that. So what I'll quickly go through here is to say, so as we're doing this and as we have these questions about how do we diversify this more, how are we more equitable, inclusive in this way, when people talk about justice, what does this mean, is acknowledging that there's different reasons why people are engaging that are not just purely focused on somebody's individual choice, that there can be more than that in terms of what's supported by policy, what's supported by culture, and institutional setups. So that's part of the work. And so when we look at, when we ask about these questions of representation, it's important to acknowledge that the data, what can the data tell us that doesn't automatically affirm what we think or believe, and allows us to look a little deeper and then be able to think, so how can we do some things differently? So even from this example from the Outdoor Industry Association, that shows like, okay, these are general trends, and we can say in this case a Black demographic, it's significantly lower than other demographics in engagement. Doesn't automatically mean Black communities don't care or aren't engaging in the outdoors. It's for us to be able to say what else could be happening in relation to kind of this curve, right? It isn't just like, oh, we only have this amount of intentional user. What could also be happening to explain other areas? So as this example from the 2017 Nature of American study, so this is a national study, you look at this question to say interest in hiking lowest among Black adults. So here you notice that in this case, the Black demographic category is at 19% in terms of high interest. But if you ask the question interest in walking outdoors, all of a sudden all of these go up. So what's the difference between hiking and walking outdoors, right? That allows us to interrogate this idea of what is the culture of outdoor engagement. So whether you're an educator, an outdoor fitter, anyone that has a space in the outdoors, what is it that you are continue to communicate in terms of what's accepted, not accepted, valued, and not valued, relative to what the actual thing is? Right. So this is part of then to be able to unpack that a little bit more. And so I'll close by saying this allows us to dig into these questions of when we talk about cultural change, is to say, well, is the way that I see the world, that I am in relationship with others, the way that my work culture is set up, if that's normal to me, that's great. That lets me know this space is designed with me in mind and I fit in, right? I belong. What does that mean for others that don't? And what are you able to do in terms of co-sharing that space and co-sharing that power to shape things differently for other ways of doing, for other ways of being, for other ways of engaging with this work? That's what we mean about some of this work in relation to culture and workspace. And to prepare us for our panel discussion, this means being able to say, well, if I'm going to face some new information, it is quote unquote normal to to feel a level of discomfort, to experience some fragility, to feel defensive as to like, well, does this mean that I'm being called out on something? Not necessarily. It could also just mean we're challenging ourselves to be able to look at the space and the world slightly different, and that we can engage with that by asking questions of reflection rather than statements of defensiveness. And ask, why does this unsettle me? What does it mean if this is true? How does this lens change my understanding? And this can be much more productive in thriving together, moving forward. And when we face conflict, breaking together rather than breaking apart, to be able to have to engage with that future that we're moving forwards to. So three considerations how I approach this work is about knowing, doing, and changing. The knowing is awareness work. This is when you start reading the book, you listen to the podcast, you start a discussion group, and this is what our conversation today is going to be centered around. It doesn't mean that you weren't ready for more. It's just to acknowledge that in spaces where you're still trying to figure out what are some of the best things we can do, it starts by being aware of what the terms are, what the conversation is happening, what are the concepts, how can we talk about, how do we approach this? So that when we then encounter a lot of new information that can seem terrifying or that can seem very different, and you're like, what does my work have to do with any of this? For me, it's being able to say, okay, I don't need to be able to use all of these terms. I need to acknowledge that that may not be where I am, and yet the work that I do is still connected to some of this, so that I'm prepared. And that's what I tell a lot of people that I work with. I want you to have the tools, the language to be ready, so that you're not surprised by a conversation, even if you aren't always in it. And the last two components are the action is, what do you do? What is the action work? Once you know better, what do you do better and differently? So moving beyond the statement. And the transformation is the changing the space. What are the actual structural pieces that you move around so that when you know better and you do better, those changes and actions and those behaviors are happening in a space that's more supportive rather than in a space in which you're kind of continually fighting against. And that can be messy, transformative work. And that's okay. That's how you get from the butterfly to from the caterpillar to the butterfly, because everything gets liquefied, but it relies on the imaginal cells, right? And I love that alliteration to imaginal cells. It's like the imagination. It relies on what's still at core of who we are and what we do, that retains the information that allows the transformation to move to the next stage. And that's where values work, for example, kicks in. So we're going to focus on the awareness work, but I want you to let you know how this connects to all of it. So it isn't just that you either don't feel you're doing enough, and that what you do can be enough depending on where you are. But when we talk about systemic change, it incorporates all these pieces that we talk about why you do specific trainings and workshops, because they can all have an impact on this, from everything about how we view and think about the world, our mental models, to the policy changes, whether it's in HR or at the federal level, to the relationships that hold with each other. This is what that kind of work looks like. All right, so I'll pause there. I will pause to see if the survey is ready, and then we'll jump into our conversation.
Beth, can you put the survey results back up? The panelists can't see them, so I'm not sure. Maybe someone in the chat window could say whether they saw the results. One of the participants of the attendees.
No, okay.
No, attendee didn't either. So Beth, maybe you can put the results up. Yeah, the attendees are saying they didn't see it either. We may have technical issues. We might have to send these out separately afterwards. If we can't see it, we'll give Beth a little bit more time to see if we can pull them up.
That is, well, that's okay. And then no problem. We'll continue weaving back and forth. All right, we're going to jump into a few questions with our panelists here. Valerie Pufal, she or hers has a background in youth education, directed a high school outdoor program for a decade, and has led over 200 weeks of backcountry programs for youth and adult. She has also completed extensive training for facilitating diverse groups, creating equitable spaces, and professional coaching with a focus on personal power. Valerie is currently the executive director of LEAP, Life Expanding Adventure Programs, a nonprofit multi-day whitewater program for youth and adults who are navigating trauma and overcoming adversity. So welcome, Valerie. Next, we have Greg Mcfadden, he, him, his. Greg has been commercially rowing and kayaking 6 and 12-day river trips on the Middle Fork and Maine Salmon since 1994. Still guiding, he owns Canyons River Company based out of McCall. As one of the only LGBTQ owner outfitters, possibly ever, in Idaho, Greg has been running a variety of diverse trips in his career, slowly changing the face of Idaho and the industry. So welcome, Greg. And last but not least, Justin Salomon, he and his. Since the late 1990s, Justin has been a guide and educator with a focus in outdoor experiential education. Justin is currently the operations and guide manager at Canyon Explorations, which offers 13 to 18-day oar and paddle expeditions through the Grand Canyon, focusing on exploration and education. For the last 3 decades, Canyon Explorations has been committed to gender equity, has strived to be a safe space for LGBTQ employees and participants, and has also been successful in providing trips for people with disabilities. Now we are aware of the many challenges ahead of us, and we work towards a safe and inclusive culture for all identities. So welcome, Justin. All right. So knowing we will be challenged and constrained by time, which is okay, we're going to start with one of the first questions. And Valerie, we'll start with you. For the first round of questions, I'll ask each of you a question. However, if any of you feel you also want to add and jump in on the question, feel free to do so as well. But Valerie, I want to start with you because being in a nonprofit space can be both very familiar to a lot of people in the audience, as well as can be very different, right? If somebody hasn't had that nonprofit experience. So what have you been finding that has been your area of focus in terms of approaching diversity, whether it's the programmatic component or the leadership spaces? Like how have you been approaching this work?
Yeah. So before I was the executive director, I was the program director for 3 years. And so a lot of the way that we've been focusing has been looking at what are the things that we've learned from working with very diverse groups of participants, and what are the changes that we have made to the way that we recruit staff, the way that we train staff, the way that we work on program delivery, and what are the values within that. And so as an organization, then we're looking at where have the success, like where have we experienced success or transformation in the program delivery, and how can we apply that across the organization? So our nonprofit structure is where we have a handful of different committees that are made up of board members as well as other members in the community who are interested in supporting our work. And so that is a place where we are starting to just expand that conversation into all of those different aspects of our organization, from finances to fundraising to the different fundraising events that we put on, as well as to the programs and our operation. And so how can we look through a lens of equity and inclusion as in all of those different areas of our organization. And so as business owners, I'm sure that it's very similar, just a slightly different structure that we have. So that's where I would start, I guess. Thanks.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Valerie. And then next we'll switch over to Greg. So thinking about that commercial slant, as you noted, Greg, what have you found in terms of, for example, like you mentioned, broadening your base, hiring or guide allies? Like what have been some of the things that you found as you've approached this work?
Thanks for the question. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd say from our authentic background, just being a LGBTQ owned and identifying with that, we've definitely attracted a number of guides kind of from all walks. And I think by being able to have that platform and being able to have offered LGBTQ trips specifically was a nice start for us. I don't think that's the end game. I think we've seen that by being able to have done that, say, 10 years ago and be consistent with that. And now we see a broader swath through all of our trips. So, but by starting somewhere, we were able to kind of open our doors to that particular community. So it creates a safe space in that way. We've done the same thing when things kind of happened more recently last spring. I think we all asked ourselves the question, like, what can we do as a business, as a whitewater industry, and here in some of our Western states, it's just not really that diverse of a populace, with even our neighboring states here in the great state of Idaho and so forth. So I reached across the country, did some research, and we're working with a nonprofit called the Greening Youth Foundation out of Atlanta that kind of streams young adults. They do a number of different programs, but one of their big programs is they stream young adults into job opportunities, mainly through agency stuff, but there hasn't been that much commercial introduction. So we're excited to be launching a trip with them in 2022, and we're still arranging the semantics of that, whether it'll be just their staff or kind of introing some of their young adults into how commercial guiding works and getting their first experiences of multi-day rafting. So I think just kind of opening your doors to different communities helps broaden your base, even if it has to start with specialized trips, but then that really does thread into your greater river community as a whole. And we've seen that happen in a good way, systemically, I guess you could say. So that's good.
Thank you so much, Greg. And I know one of the questions was asked, what's the name of the organization? So Greening Youth Foundation out of Atlanta. I know Angelou, who's the CEO and founder of that. So great example. And we'll loop back to this because I think that's a really good example of how partnerships, intentional partnership with organizations in that way can be helpful. And Justin, I want to ask similarly, what have you found as you approach this work? I know you mentioned gender equity being an example, but don't want you to feel limited to that. I'm just curious, like jumping into this, what has come out for you?
Thanks, Jose. Good to see all the names out there in the attendees. Thanks everybody for being here. And, maybe before I answer, I just want to say that when I was asked to be on this panel, I thought to myself, what am I doing here? I'm a cisgender white guy who has had all the privilege in the world. And it really got me thinking about what do I have to share in this space? I haven't had the same struggles that other people have had, but it's been a space that I've wanted to work in for really decades. And it got me thinking about what are we doing at Canyon Explorations, and really the places that are the hardest to break into. We've done better with gender equity. That's why I've listed it there. We were originally female owned in the 80s at a time when that wasn't happening as much. Of course, in Grand Canyon, we had Georgie White, who was a great example early on. But that wasn't as prevalent in the work world and in the Grand Canyon outfitting world in particular. So we have been really good at promoting gender equity in our crews and in our employees overall. We've always attracted for numerous reasons, for specialty trips, LGBTQ, folks in the LGBTQ community, and have been a safe space for that, and especially in the 90s and going on till today. And, moving out into a broader community and looking at diversity in the places that we struggle more, I would echo, Greg's talk about partnerships. We've done a good job with that through our disabilities trips, partnered with Environmental Travel Companions, ETC out of San Francisco, who serve a more diverse population. We've done a good job with that with Wilderness Inquiry out of Minnesota. And it's also a space where we feel like we're preparing the ground, and we struggle to figure out how to have more Indigenous voices and on our crew, and more people in the BIPOC community, Black, Indigenous, people of color in our crews, and also attracting that for our clientele. And so I think we're in more of a space of how do we do this, and the awareness. We want to take action steps. But yeah, we're learning.
Just to say, Justin, when you next speak, can you up your audio a little bit? I'm hearing from folks you're a little quiet, so just
sure.
maybe up audio. That'd be great. Thank you.
I can speak louder.
Thank
There
you.
you go. Projection. Love it. Thank you, Justin, Greg and Valerie, for that. So the next round of questions, we'll really be open to whoever would like to jump in to start, and you feel that applies. I appreciate, so for example, Justin, as you mentioned, right, being in that space of learning and reflection in terms of awareness around privilege, and what does that mean moving forward. And so my next question is related to that in terms of what have you found. I want to make a note of, like, we've been using some of the acronyms that might be new to some people. So Justin, you mentioned BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. We've been using LGBTQ. And so my two-part question here is, one, right? Diversity is powerful and important when it's focused and you're actually being able to say, this is what it means. And Justin, as you mentioned, how we can be more successful with one community and then struggle with another, because it isn't automatically to say we do it this way and then it's supposed to work that way. So my question is, what have you found in terms of finding this is what we can celebrate and be successful, and then this is how we're struggling, and that those in themselves don't have to be exclusive of each other. You can hold all of these aspects together as you're continuing to run forward. So that's my question in terms of, like, how did you find, wow, this is how we can be really successful here, and this is how we're applying this here, and understanding what's challenging about understanding and valuing the difference of engaging with a different community. So whoever wants to jump first.
I can start, since I'll just say, a lot of what we've learned through working with people with disabilities, it's person first, disability second. And so that really, it's person first identity is important to acknowledge, but we are really good, I think. I'm always asking myself these questions as we say that we're good at something. Are we really showing up in that way? But we're good in our company culture at checking in with each other, spending the time to know and take the temperature of each person throughout a day's work, and do the same with our clientele so that we really know what's going on individually. And I think that person-focused approach allows for the diversity to kind of flourish, and something that we hopefully can apply and we've been successful in little pockets as we progress.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you said there, Justin, about the person first, and the idea that we've certainly found in our program delivery that when we look at all of the little aspects from the info packet that our participants get to the way that things are shared with families and the questions that we anticipate receiving, especially for youth who are more from an urban space coming out to rural Idaho, and some of the different questions that come from particularly families of color about what does that mean for my kid, and is that a safe space for them? And so there's just being able to anticipate those questions, as well as look at everything that happens from the moment they get information to the very end, and whatever information they get after their experience, and how each of those things plays into that opportunity for people to be themselves first, and to encounter people that way, not as whatever identities they're bringing into that space, that those don't have to be the thing that is forward initially because they need to defend against something or advocate for something, but because those things have already been thought about by our staff and our program curriculum and every aspect of how that's delivered. So I think that that has been a huge lesson for us, and it's not perfect, and there's always places where we're continuing to learn and reflect. But I think that that also, to kind of go into the second part of your question too, Jose, is how are we kind of running that up the chain of our operation, that, and in our leadership of our organization, that, like some of you also mentioned, you know, that's an area that's newer for us. We're definitely more in the awareness phase of that, and looking at what are the cultural aspects across our whole organization, and where do we create more awareness, and how do we do that systematically, like we have done with our program delivery. So that's what I would add to that.
Thank you, Valerie. Greg?
Yeah, I would just say also along those lines, in addition to programmatic or even kind of internally, as both Justin and Valerie were referring to, one thing that has been a good check for me, and I'll go back to some of the specialty trips that we really pushed when I first became a river guide and wanted to kind of, just show that there was maybe a different approach to doing some trips. That's again now led up to, we have a number of different families, and we've had a number of gay weddings. We've had a number of transgendered kids over the last couple of years, and their families show up. So we've really, by kind of literally waving that flag a bit, it was able to show that it was a safe space in a broad spectrum of all of our trips, beyond just focusing in on that one kind of specialty thing. But you have to start somewhere with that. So for us, as a greater trend, it's been nice to kind of reflect back and be like, okay, well, this week, you guys, we have a gay wedding at this, and it's not necessarily a specific trip or whatever. Now, along those lines too, just because all of our guiding careers and paths have had many different influences and affects over the years, and we have guides of all ages and so forth, we still do pretty active training. And we brought in Emily Ambrose this past year just to do some diversity training, even though that's kind of a foundation for us, just for letting some of our other guides who might not feel as comfortable ask simple questions, and even to our own staff. But it just was nice to have a facilitator to kind of bring that in from out of our realm, just to help continue with our progress there. But it's one way we've been able to keep our finger on the pulse, I think, in some ways.
Thank you, Greg. And thank you to participants. I know you're beginning to filter questions in, so that's great. I'll ask one more then, so we can have enough time to get some of the ones that are being asked. A couple of great things some of the things that I heard you mention, Justin, by saying person first, disability second, was a really good example of how that can be applied across the board, and also why it has been keenly important within the disability community to say, this is why it's really important for us to do this, because of what tends to be centered different than what we're asking you to acknowledge and see us, right? This is part of why I'm wearing this shirt as well. It's saying it's when I say protect Black joy, it doesn't mean that you don't protect everybody's joy. Everybody should have an experience to joy. But so often Black joy tends to be the thing that is decentered or taken away along with native sovereignty as a particular component. So I really like how you frame that in the applicability. And then the other components, as you mentioned, Greg, is like take a step, right? What are key things that you don't have to have right, but that will signal something to others to know this is what we're willing to demonstrate that we're working on, rather than being able to say it's perfect, because I think that too many people get stuck, which will come back to a question that I have. And Valerie, I think also I appreciate what you mentioned around just paying attention to what's working well, and then how do you move that into different spaces? Because to me, it allows me to reflect on the question of what is, what do I take as obvious that may not be obvious to somebody else, and unpack that, and what's normative for me, which connects to what Greg, I like how you mentioned that, just because it's a foundational training doesn't mean you keep training in the same way that you would have training for everything that you're already doing. You think about it that way. So my question around that is for whoever wants, for all of you, whoever wants to jump into it, what is the hard part? Like, what have you found? Sometimes it might be hard to talk about it, but it is just, what's the hard part? Like, what's the challenge that you're really facing right now? And I'm asking this not because you have to have an answer, but I think sometimes people ask the question of what do I do, and then feeling I don't know what to do, or I don't want to do anything because I'm afraid to mess up. So how do you think through that process of facing something hard?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think kind of where we're at as an organization is kind of having to slow it down in some ways, that I think there is often this impulse towards like, let's take all this action and just like skip the awareness education phase of things, which is super important. And so that internal reflection, taking the time it takes to really build that awareness, and then moving into action once you have done some of that work. And so some examples of that would just be like, I got some of our board members to read My Grandmother's Hands this summer, because we specifically work with folks who have experienced trauma, and that book is centered around trauma in the body. And that was a really great way for us to, as a group, to build some awareness about like what is trauma like in the body, and how is that different for Black bodies than white bodies, and like how have all of these things happened, and what is living there, and how does that increase our awareness, and how does that then influence the work that we want to take on. And so I think being able to take a step back and slow things down a little bit when there is this big impulse towards action can be really helpful. But not hanging out there forever is also really important too, that we do have to find some sense of momentum. We do have to find, like Greg was saying, one place where we can begin. And so, an example there, we have like DEI prompts as the beginning of all of our different committee meetings. That's connected to, what the purpose of that group or that meeting is, and how can we be reflective, what can we acknowledge is already working well, where do we have areas for growth, and sometimes there's action steps that come out of that, which is really cool. So those are just some examples of how we're like meeting those challenges and what is hard. There's plenty of things that we haven't solved that are difficult, and a lot of that's around staffing and leadership. And, I think a lot of people are in that same boat of how do we diversify the leadership of our companies or organizations more thoroughly. So, haven't solved it, but there's all of that awareness tends to bring in more information about where we can post jobs and how we can change the language in the way that we write our job posts. There's all sorts of different things there that we could dive into.
Thank you, Valerie. Justin or Greg?
Go ahead, Justin.
Okay. Let's see. So I think of more of what comes up is our challenges. And one thing that comes up, and that's probably true for most of us in the outfitting community, is that we are operating on lands that were where the native peoples were either forcibly removed, or if they still have their homelands there, they've been diminished. And we're working with, particularly in the Grand Canyon, I'll use our example. You know, we've got 11 affiliated tribes, and each tribe has a different relationship with Grand Canyon, a different way that they would like us to be interacting with the place or not interacting with the place. And so the desire to get more native voices into that space is really, I think we have to keep on examining what our, that is sort of a desire from our dominant culture. And we would love to be employing more indigenous people, but how we go about that really has to look different than the ways that maybe we think it does. You know, it's easy to say, you know, this is the hiring process, and that has worked for us because the people that have come to us are comfortable with that hiring process and what we do. And really, we need to be ready to change how we do things in order to invite more voices into our world. So, you know, where we've been successful is bringing more Native and Indigenous voices into our interpretive training, bringing their Native interpreters in to help us understand their stories directly from them. As far as being able to bring more Native people into our crews, it's been more difficult. And in particular in Grand Canyon, where we have some real challenges, is it requires a certain level of experience to start the work in Grand Canyon as a guide. And we have amazing feeder organizations like Grand Canyon Youth, but we don't have the training mechanisms yet. And we have some ideas about how to do this. But that's a big challenge for us, and we're thinking about that. And then lastly, I'll just say, you know, we've talked about in our task force how we develop marketing materials and that sort of thing to attract more people. And there's some questions there in the question, the Q&A, that how important is representation to attracting more people? Well, it certainly seems like it's very important, but we don't want to be disingenuous and just put the picture of people of color on our river trips when they're really like a small percentage of who's coming with us. So it's this chicken or egg thing, and I don't have a good answer to that, just an expression of the challenge that we're grappling with.
Thank you, Justin. Grant?
Yeah, I would say too that it's, you know, we're kind of in an enlightenment where we're finally having discussions about this, and we're really just planting the seeds right now. And so it's pretty fertile ground in that we are having the conversations. B, it's a really amazing time to go outside in anywhere in the world. So that's also a little sprinkling in our fertile grounds as another touch point to any community right now, anywhere. And so there are some great things that are opportunities for us right now, but I think we can't get too focused on not nurturing that garden and wanting to reap the harvest so quickly, and or see these blossoms already happening. So just knowing it's going to take time. There's a question in the Q&As from Foy, who asked about expand on what it took to promote LGBTQ trips. Well, it took, you know, 20 years of me saying, okay, this is like the worst, you know, marketing, you know, idea you could have is to have LGBTQ trips in central Idaho. But, you know, we've persevered, and it's just through our communities that's started to build for us. And you just have to be, again, nurturing to these directions and give it patience and time. And also, I think the thing that's easy to just feel like you're going to fail on is that there's a lot of different languages that are being spoken within all of these communities, and how do you kind of come to the same language together? And it's okay to fail at doing that. It's just to be honest and authentic to yourself and explain to whoever, whatever community you're branching out to, that you don't have all the answers, you want to learn and you want to become more inclusive, because all of our products and the places we're taking people are so important right now. So I think that's the bigger scope. So again, opportunity is really big right now, and I think it's refreshing to see that this conversation is happening simultaneously with that.
Thank you so much, Greg, and I appreciate you all jumping in with some of the answers as well. I'm going to ask you all, if you're able to drop any preferred social media handles in the chat, so that participants can either give you a follow, or if they're tweeting or the like, quote you as preferred. Again, your choice. And I appreciate how you're mentioning how as things are hard, you're still finding ways to approach them, and the practical considerations that you're saying about being patient, taking time. There's some things you can't rush, while also how much of that is seeding and being supportive of that growth process. So that when you face things, I think, as Justin, when you mentioned, one of the things that came up to me is we often say, if you hear that your stoke is on stolen land, nobody's saying don't have stoke. It's just be aware of what that means, and unpack that, right? Valerie, one of the questions that came up here is, for you, is saying, you mentioned creating materials such as trip info packets to get ahead of the questions you might face from different communities. Can you give an example on ways that you've done this?
Yeah, and a lot of that has just come from learning and experiencing questions that are coming, and then realizing like, oh, this isn't just this one kid that has this question, or this one person. And so how do we incorporate that into the materials? So some of that could be like, we work with some hospital groups and folks who are patients at hospitals as youth or as burn survivors. Those are the two particular groups that we work with. And so those folks tend to have a really specific set of questions about like, what are the resources that will be available to me for my medication, or for a particular physical need that I have. So other examples would be things like what I said earlier about families and parents who are asking, like, is my kid going to be safe in this totally different environment that in my mind is, like a very like rural space in Idaho? It's very different than the experience they have in a more urban place in Portland, Oregon. And is that going to be a safe space for them? Can I trust that they're going to be okay? And so like, those are some of the questions that tend to come up, but that's also, we work with partnerships of other nonprofits and hospital groups. And so those are not, those are also pretty specific to those different demographics within those groups. So I think it's really important that we're also not like creating that single story about a particular group of people or particular identity, but what are the things we're learning from those different groups, and who needs to hear that, and how do we make that as part of the whole experience that we're giving to someone, so that they can lean into it, the challenge of what we are inviting them to do as a whole person, and not be concerned about, am I going to be comfortable to sleep because I am not sure how like my gender identity is going to be respected in this space. And so what are the ways that we can promote that as part of our literature, knowing that we have people who are going to come on our programs who that matters to, like, very significantly.
Thank you, Valerie. I actually want to connect this to another question for all of you, however you want to answer this. Because the question here is, as an example, is within a guide team, what kind of additional support and acknowledgement would women and people of color appreciate on a team that is likely made up of predominantly white men? So I want to connect that to the question of safety, right? Because safety shows up in a lot of ways. So there's the way that you prepare for safety as maybe familiar to you in terms of the technical expertise, what you want everybody to know. And then there's safety in terms of that might be specific to a community in ways that you would maybe know or don't know. So I'm connecting safety to kind of acknowledgement as a way to be seen, heard, and valued in ways that that may not be familiar to you, especially if it's predominantly a white male space. So I'm curious how that's had come up for you, or ways that you've approached it, things that you have learned, or as Greg has mentioned, additional language that you maybe picked up along the way. Whoever wants to take that one.
Go ahead, Justin.
You can go ahead, Greg.
All right. Well, I would say, first of all, with some of our hiring, because you're referring to guide teams, we actually have more women that work for us than men. So that's been a transformation since I've kind of owned the company the last 13 years or so. Back when I first started, it wasn't quite the same, but we've always kind of had definitely a significant team of women in addition to men on our team. So I think that's some of what you can initially do hiring that seems pretty simple, and there's and kind of making that a equal playing field in that way. It's definitely still not the majority, I wouldn't say, here in Idaho with a lot of the teams that we see out there, but it has changed significantly in the last couple decades. I think, again, just sort of having some training early seasons and on that folds into your daily routine of being able to check in, take temperatures, just kind of see where you're at, and be able to have safe spaces that you know you're going to mess up, or you're going to be able to just dialogue about certain ways of living together, particularly with guide teams, giving it the attention to just be addressed is an easy way to just learn from each other. And I think that's where we learn the most. I think there's the tides have changed a lot in the last, since I started guiding or started doing rivers in the late 80s, for sure. But I think there's still a lot of room for growth in that. And I think we've seen a lot of big things that we're able to bring to the table, even as discussion points, whether it's things that unfolded in the Grand Canyon just a number of years ago, even on an administrative or a agency level, that came to light through Outside Magazine and so forth, into just all of the topics that are happening today. So it's a good time for conversation, and it's a good time to make sure that's a programmatic point with all of your teams, I would say.
Thank you, Greg. And we're getting at our end of time. So Justin and Valerie, if there's anything you would quickly add. With no obligation, of course.
I think the only thing I would highlight there is what is the structure that you're creating for your guide team to lean into that accomplishes group agreements and group safety, and gives people a voice all of the time and routinely, so that we're not making assumptions or assuming things about different people than ourselves, and gives people the opportunity to always have that established safe space to have those conversations.
Thank you. Justin?
I would just say being available as a manager always to listen to all of the voices and give people the space to express that are on your crews, and hear those different voices. And yeah, that's all.
Thank you, Justin. So I want to give enough time to Julie to kind of close us out. So if you don't mind, Greg and Justin and Valerie, the last question I had with you as a challenge, they'll give you some time to think about it and write it while Julie's sharing, and then drop it in the chat, please. What would be, if you could pick one thing that you're able to state in one sentence, that the audience can take? It doesn't have to be the best or whatnot, just a thing, like read this book, take this training, listen to this quote, whatever might be one thing as an action component. What would it be? And then just write it in the chat. So I want to thank you all, because time goes by extremely fast, and I want to turn it over to Julie to make sure that she gets the time to close us out.
Where does the time go? I'm busy taking all kinds of notes and writing all my own ahas down. We had one more question, and maybe Amanda had a question for Valerie, and maybe Amanda can reach out, examples on kinds of trip information that helps diverse groups feel comfortable. Thank you everyone for participating. Lots of ahas, lots of interesting ways to think about this issue and ways to show up and participate. You know, my biggest takeaway is have courage, keep going, and don't quit, right? And do the hard work, look carefully, and question all your assumptions, because within the seeds of those assumptions, you'll understand how to even think about what is really a safe space, you know, for example. There is a survey that Beth will pop into the chat window for everyone to take. If you would please fill that out at the end of the session, that would be great. And then we have another quick poll. I suspect that can come up. We had some issues with, there it is. Yeah, we panelists can't vote, but there's the quick poll. If you could go ahead and fill that out, that will be important for our task force. We will be looking to get that information from everyone. So again, I want to thank you all for coming, and panelists, I really want to thank you for being here, and Jose, thank you so much for joining us at America Outdoors. We hope to be able to work with you a lot in the future.
Thank you all. I'll hang around for one quick minute until we all get kicked out, but just make sure if you get a quick chance, all the panelists dropped in their quick recommendation. So with that, thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day.